Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we're going to be going over and showing you how to install the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system here on our 2021 Jeep Wrangler Unlimited. So what is a supplemental braking system and do we really need one? So a supplemental braking system is basically just going to help your motorhome out. You're not going to be wearing down the brakes in your motorhome as much because we're actually going to be using the brakes on our Jeep here when we come to a stop. It's going to allow for much more safer and effective stopping. So in regards to requirements, pretty much every state nowadays requires a supplemental braking system to be used on a towed vehicle when it's over a certain weight. Our Jeeps here are certainly, I wouldn't say they're really heavy, but they definitely are going to exceed that requirement in pretty much every state. So it's safe to say that you are going to be required to have a supplemental braking system. The Air Force One here is going to be an excellent option if you have a motorhome with air brakes. If you have a motorhome with hydraulic brakes, that's when you'll want to consider pretty much the counterpart to this system, which is the Demco Stay and Play. So this is actually a proportional system, meaning it's going to apply the brakes in the Jeep in an amount proportional to that as we're applying them in the motorhome. So if someone cuts in front of us in the highway and we're really slamming on our brakes, we're going to get a ton of braking force sent to our Jeep so we can really slow our rig down. Now on the contrary, let's say we're just moseying around town, we need to come to a slow stop at a stoplight. We obviously don't want to send a ton of force to the Jeep here and risk locking the brakes up. Therefore, it's just going to apply a nice, smooth, and even pressure. So the way this actually works is because the motorhome has air brakes, we're actually going to be using part of that air pressure to apply the brakes here on our Jeep. So you don't have to worry about splicing into any brake lines or anything. It's simply going to use that air pressure on the motorhome side, and then it's going to depress the brakes on a Jeep here using an air cylinder we have mounted under the dash. So our kit is actually composed of a few different components. The first component we're going to talk about is going to be the brake monitor, which is what we have mounted on the dash here. So basically what your brake monitor is going to do is it's going to let us know when the brakes are being applied in our Jeep. So we can't always see what's going on back there when we're driving behind our motorhome. And if something does happen and the brakes start applying in our Jeep, we obviously don't want to drag it with the brakes being applied. We're going to tear everything up. So having some sort of fail-safe system here so we can really see what's going on when we can't actually physically see the Jeep is really just going to give us more peace of mind that we're not damaging our vehicle or there's no false braking. Next, we'll go over our air tank, which is what we see here. So our air tank is pretty much going to be sort of a storage tank that's going to take some of the pressure from the RV using the air brakes. Now don't worry, this won't hurt anything. It's going to store this pressure and then it's going to transfer it to our vehicle there when we need the brakes to be applied. Next, we have our jumper cable. And what our jumper cable does is it simply allows for a pass-through for the air from the motorhome side to transfer it over here to the Jeep. It's very easy to use. There's a quick disconnect port on either end here, and it has a coil design there so it's not going to drag the ground. So now moving on to our Jeep, we have the operating unit, which is this device here. Now this is sort of the brain of the operation. We're going to feed air to this from the motorhome, and this is going to sort of act as a valve to apply the correct amount of pressure to the air cylinder inside, which is what's physically depressing the brake pedal. And then under the dash of our vehicle here, we have the actual air cylinder, which we talked about is going to get a supply there from the operating unit. And this is actually anchored to the firewall. So whenever it gets the correct amount of pressure there and it receives that signal, it's going to depress our pedal like so. And this is actually going to be what applies the brakes in the vehicle to help us come to a smooth stop. So that's pretty much it for our look at all the individual components. Now, in regards to the installation, I wouldn't say it's too challenging, but you kind of need to know what you're doing a little bit. This is really on the edge of whether or not a weekend warrior can do this. You really need to have some sort of experience because there's not a whole lot of room for air when you're splicing into the air lines on the motorhome. Now, the way the motorhome's brakes are designed, the air brakes that is, if you cut the wrong line, it's not like your motorhome just going to roll down the hill there. It just actually won't move. So you just really need to be careful and do your due diligence when you're making your modifications to the motorhome. But for the vehicle side, this is all pretty straightforward. I would say that is something a probably weekend warrior can do, but the motorhome side is where it can get kind of tricky. So just do your research, and if you feel comfortable, we can actually walk you through the entire process. In regards to the tools you're going to need, just some various common hand tools. Pretty much most tool sets are going to have everything you need. There may be a couple tools that you see us using that you may need to go pick up, but aside from that, it's not really a big deal, and you guys can save yourselves thousands on installation by doing this one at home. So the first part of our installation, we need to find a good place to mount our operating unit. Now you can mount this anywhere you like, but I usually find the best place to be in the engine bay if you have space. And this is a pretty low profile operating unit here, so you should have clearance right above the fuse box. So 9 times out of 10, this is where I try to mount it first because it's the most accessible location, and it's also going to be protected in the engine bay. So what we did is we just went ahead and set our operating unit on top of the fuse box here, made sure I could close the hood and there's no issues. And once I've determined there weren't any clearance issues, I went ahead and drilled into the top of the fuse box. So here is a closer look at how we attached it. So as you can see here, we can still remove the fuse box lid perfectly fine. But what I did is I had to bend one of the flanges on the operating unit. This one is still straight like it comes from the factory, whereas the other one, sort of maneuver this so you can see it a little bit better. The other one, you can see here, we actually had to bend down because in order to get all 4 attachment points onto the fuse box lid there, we did have to go ahead and bend that. And then what I did is I drilled 2 holes in each of our 4 corners. So I drilled one hole that's going to line up with this hole here, and then I drilled one hole down beneath, and then I just simply stuck a zip tie through there. A nice heavy duty zip tie there is going to be perfect. And then we actually used some silicone underneath to seal it off. So you can see there, I did that for all 4 of our attachment points. So I've used nuts and bolts before and they do work great, but one thing you need to run in, or one thing you can run into is if you really cinch those zip ties down super tight, or if you use nuts and bolts, it can sometimes kind of deform the lid here for our fuse box cover, which is going to sort of break that watertight seal. So you need to be careful to have it nice and secure, but not too tight that it's going to be deforming the fuse box lid. And although it is a little bit trickier to get it on and off now, it is still possible there. So that's another thing we need to take into consideration here when we're mounting it there, is that our fuse box is still accessible there in case we have any issues. But now as you can see, we'll just drop it right back down into place. And it's secure just like it would be from the factory. So the next thing we're going to be mocking up is our breakaway switch and the quick disconnect port. So this part of the installation, we're just going to go over all the major components and how we have them installed on the vehicle, and then we'll show you how they all intertwine and interconnect with one another. But with that being said, this part of the installation here is going to vary a little bit depending on what base plate kit you use. So we used a Roadmaster base plate kit for this vehicle here, and they actually include a bracket that you see here with their kit. Now I really love this bracket because it allows us to integrate all of our different components into one single thing here on the vehicle. So this is actually the bracket for our electrical connector. And this actually had a nice large hole on the side of there that wasn't being used. And that's what we attached our quick disconnect port there. That's going to hook up to the jumper that goes between the motorhome and the vehicle. So it's actually going to come, this particular quick connect here is going to come pre-installed on this particular bracket. So all we did is there's going to be a barbed fitting on the front and then a fitting on the back. So we just took 2 wrenches and we loosened them, and then we just re-secured it here to this bracket. So if you guys don't have this particular electrical connector bracket, that's perfectly fine. You're just going to need to find a way to attach this to the underside of the bumper here, or this plastic splash shield. You can drill into the bottom of the bumper there. Just make sure it has plenty of support there and there's no interference issues. But again, we went ahead and used a pre-existing hole that we had. So once you get that mounted up, the next thing we're going to do is the breakaway switch. So our breakaway switch here does have an integrated tab, and luckily again we were able to use an existing hole on our electrical connector bracket. I believe they designed this bracket for this exact same purpose due to how it's shaped. So again, if you don't have this, you can still mount it on the front of the vehicle. You'll just need to drill into the bottom of the bumper or the bottom of this plastic underbody paneling there. It does come with the hardware you need for this, but in our case, we just reuse the bolt there for our electrical connector bracket. So if you're on the fence about a base plate kit, this would probably be a deciding factor for me, just having everything integrated in the front here. I didn't have to drill any holes into the bumper there because this electrical connector bracket actually uses some pre-existing holes. So no more modifications really, for the exception of the access route that we need through this panel up into the engine bay. And if we look behind this electrical connector bracket here, you can see I just drilled a fairly large hole there, and this basically allows us to pass our wires through for our breakaway switch. There's going to be 2, and then the air line that comes from the back of the quick disconnect. So all I did is you're going to get a long piece of airline tubing that comes in your kit, comes in a big coil, looks like this. I just simply fed that airline tubing through that hole there and attached it to the back of the quick disconnect. And I don't have any of the other stuff hooked up behind there. I just have it draped down and out the back like so for now. So now that we've got a few of our major system components in place, we can begin connecting them to one another. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the airline tubing that we routed from the back of the quick disconnect port and our 2 breakaway wires, and we're going to route that up into the engine bay so we can make some connections. Now for your 2 breakaway wires here, you will have to extend them if this is where you choose to mount your switch. If you want to mount it over on that other side, then you may not have to, but since we're routing it over to the passenger side of the vehicle, you do need to extend those 2 wires. So go ahead and take some time now, use a couple butt connectors, you have some in your kit, along with some extra wires so you can extend these 2. But with that being said, now let's go ahead and jump under the vehicle there so we can show you how we got them up into the engine bay. So here's our plastic skid shield. We're kind of just looking at this from behind, but we have our airline tubing and our 2 breakaway wires coming out that hole that we drilled in here earlier. We're just going to route these over to the passenger side. And then once you get to the passenger side frame rail, we're pretty much just going to route them straight up. Now it is going to be hard to get your wires and lines up there because there's all kinds of components here, brake lines, we have our radiator hosers, there's all kinds of stuff in the way. So what I did is I took an extra piece of airline tubing from our kit here, and I basically just routed it through an opening up into the engine bay down until I could get it around this area here. I did have to sort of reach up there and grab it, but once I had my airline tubing down here, I just tied our other airline tubing and our 2 wires to this and then pulled them up into the engine bay. So directly behind our grill in front of our airbox, this is the opening that we snuck our wire down through there until we attached everything, then we pulled it back up, and then I'm just going to come to the side of the airbox here, and now you can see our airline tubing and our 2 breakaway wires. So what you're going to do is, number 1, we're going to take this black wire here from the breakaway switch, and we're going to run this and attach it to one of the black wires coming from our operating unit. So we actually have our connection here using one of the yellow butt connectors that come in your kit. So that should tie up your black wire here. And now we're going to move on to the airline tubing. The airline tubing we're going to run over here around the battery, and that's going to go to the air in line here on the operating unit. So make sure you have a nice square cut there. You don't want any jagged edges or cut at an angle, and just push it into the connect fitting here on the operating unit. Those are push to connect fittings, so you just push them in and you pull them out to lock them in place. And now finally, we have our orange wire from the breakaway switch. So this is kind of a tricky one because there's a couple connections. So one end is going to go to a butt connector, which attaches to our inline fuse holder here, and then the inline fuse holder is going to go to our positive battery terminal here. So I just use a socket to remove that nut there, crimped on a ring terminal to our fuse holder, and then just secured it back down. So pretty self-explanatory. But our connection here is where it can get kind of tricky because we need to take the brown/violet wire that comes in your kit. It looks brown to me, I believe they call it violet, but we're going to take that and you're going to tie that into that orange wire and then attach it to the butt connector. And then this wire here, we're going to run along the battery here like we've been running our other wires. And then we're going to run it back over to the driver's side. So there's these little channels here underneath these fasteners that you can actually just route your wire in. So we're going to take that brown wire and route it all the way over there to the driver's side, and we can show you where that goes. So once you have your brown wire over here, directly beside the brake booster and the fender, there's going to be a large grommet down in here. We'll give you a better look at that in a second, but basically we just took a drill bit in our drill and we carefully drilled a hole through that grommet there. That way we could pass our brown wire through there. And this is basically allowing us to route our wire into the vehicle where we'll hook it up later. So here's a closer look at that grommet, and as we said, we just drilled a 1/2-inch hole there because you're going to need to route both an airline tubing, which we'll show you in a minute, and that brown wire into the vehicle. Next, we should have one other black wire coming from the operating unit. Now, just to point out, it doesn't matter which wire you connect to which function, you just have to hook them both up. But we'll take one of the 2 black wires and we're going to route this over here to the negative battery terminal and ground the operating unit. So that's our ground connection here. You can see that's a different color wire than we started with. That's because you actually have to extend that black wire. It isn't going to reach over here to the battery. So just take a wire color of your choice along with a butt connector and a ring terminal, and then attach it to this stud here coming from your battery. And next we have our other airline that we showed you just a little bit ago. So we're going to take a section of the airline tubing that comes in your kit. You get a long coil, so we're just going to be cutting some of that off. You're going to attach it to the push to connect air out fitting here on your operating unit. And then we're going to pretty much route this the same way that we routed that brown wire over there to the driver's side and through that grommet into the engine or into the cab. So now at this point we should have an airline tubing and that brown wire ran into the cab of the vehicle, sort of where the driver footwell is. So we're going to leave those there for now. We're going to proceed to another step. So the last thing we need to hook up here in the engine bay is going to be our vacuum connection. So on your operating unit, you're going to have a barbed fitting labeled vacuum. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut about a 3 or 4 inch section of your vacuum hose off. and you're going to attach it to that barb fitting there. So if you're having trouble making these connections, you're definitely going to need some soapy water there just to help you slide those on a little bit easier. But once we get that 3 or 4 inch section on there, we're going to attach one of the 2 check valves that come in your kit. Make sure the black side is facing the operating unit. And then the other side of this check valve here, you're going to attach your main hose here, so the rest of the section that you have left, and then we're going to route that over to the driver's side. You can see I just kind of have it tucked back between our engine cover here and the firewall. So our vacuum should come out in this area here. We just have it zip tied to this hose here coming off the engine coolant reservoir here. So what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and snip off 3 sections about 3 or 4 inch long. And then for the end of this hose here, you're going to attach your T-fitting that comes in your kit. And then we're going to take 2 of those sections that we just cut off and attach them to the end of the barbs coming from our T-fitting. So there's going to be a factory line here coming directly from the brake booster. This is actually a factory hard line. This is part of it here, and this is part of it here. So you're going to go ahead and cut that factory hard line in half, and you're going to trim out about another 3 to 4 inches of that hard line. So there is actually a keeper here which connects to that tab. I went ahead and just removed that keeper there to give us more room to work. So now that we have the T on here and a hose on each end, we're going to attach one of those ends to the factory hose here. So all I did was I sprayed down that factory hardline there, and I just slid it into the end of our vacuum hose, and then I used one of these clamps here to secure it. And now on this hose here, we're going to install our other of our 2 check valves. We need to make sure the black side is going this way towards the engine, and the clear/green side is going towards the brake booster. And then next we're going to take our last little 3 to 4 inch section of the vacuum hose, attach one end to the end of the barb fitting, and attach the other end to the end of your hard line, and then secure it with the clamp here. So the last few steps of our installation are going to be inside the vehicle here. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to be mounting the cylinder, which pretty much anchors to the firewall, and that's what's actually going to depress our pedal for us. So here's what our cylinder looks like here, already installed, and you can see there's going to be 4 bolts and screws that attach it to the brake pedal arm. So we actually want to make sure when we're tightening this bracket down here that we have a slight bend. That's what's going to let us know when this is tight. But you don't want to tighten this finally yet. You just want to leave it loose. So go ahead and just roughly mock up the air cylinder onto the brake pedal arm here. Now we chose to have the cylinder oriented over here to the passenger side. So that's what I recommend you guys do as well. But basically there's going to be a wire coming off the end of the cylinder here, and that's going to attach to an anchor point which we screw into the firewall. So here's our anchor point. So for starters, you're going to have this plastic material here, the sort of protective covering the firewall. So you're going to go ahead and cut that section out. I just used a razor knife there, and basically we just cut the section out here that you can see the bare metal. So pretty easy, just go ahead and cut that out. And then we ran one of the self-tapping screws through the anchor point of our kit here, and we drilled that into the firewall. Now anytime you're drilling through the firewall, you want to be really careful that you're not drilling into any components behind it. So what I did before I ran the self-tapping screw through is I just simply took a small pilot drill bit, such as an 1/8 inch drill bit, and I drilled the hole through the firewall, and then I stuck a wire through there, and then I sort of looked down at the engine bay if I could see where that wire coming out, just to make sure you're not drilling in anything such as the brake booster. Now luckily this area here is pretty clear, so you guys shouldn't have any concerns, but it's always a good idea to double check. So go ahead and anchor this point here using the self-tapping screw that comes in your kit. Now you're also going to get a 3-hole bracket, but unfortunately that's not really going to work well for this particular setup here, so we're not going to be using that. It's not required, but it is a good idea to use it when you have enough space. But again, for this application, we don't have enough space, so we're actually just going to be mounting it to this surface here. It's nice and flat. And then you're going to have to play with the adjustment here of your cable. So a lot of the setting up and fine-tuning of this process here is just simply depressing the brake pedal there while you're pulling the actuator back, because what we're looking for is a nice straight line on that cable. We don't want it at too much of an angle because it can actually break. And we're also going to be playing with the slack here. We want a little bit of slack, but we don't want too much. So there's actually an Allen screw on the bottom of this anchor here that we can tighten and loosen to adjust the slack. Now chances are after you activate the system a couple times, it's going to have some more slack than you did when you started out, so you have to go back and adjust that. But yeah, that's pretty much it here for the air cylinder. Just make sure your cable is nice and straight, you have a sturdy mounting point there on the firewall, and you're bending the bracket around the brake pedal arm to hold it in place. So here's where we're going to hook up the two lines, or the line and the wire that we ran in here earlier. You remember we ran a brown wire in the airline tubing. So the airline tubing actually just goes to that push to connect fitting on the top of the cylinder. So I went ahead and cut the excess off and then just simply put it into that fitting there. And I used a zip tie, that way it doesn't fall down and get in the way of our brake pedal. So now that button's add up. Now we're going to have a bonded duplex wire coming from the air cylinder here. This is known as our reed switch. So your reed switch is going to have two wires coming from it. You're going to have a violet and a blue wire. Now I would like to point out at this time that Demco actually recently changed the wiring here of this reed switch. The newer one has these two wires, whereas the older one has the three wires. You can still hook it up no matter how many wires are coming from your reed switch, but it will be a little bit different. So ours is a new 2-wire reed switch here. The blue wire here coming from the reed switch is going to go to the red wire to our wireless Coachlink controller, which we'll show you in a second. And then the brown wire, they call it the violet wire, from the reed switch is going to go to that brown wire that we routed in here earlier, which is tied in line between the battery and the breakaway. Here's our Coachlink controller. So your Coachlink controller is going to come in your kit here, and we just attach it to this metal bracket here. And basically we just use the included hook and loop fasteners that come in there. One side sticks onto the back of the controller, the other side sticks on that metal arm there, and then we're just going to attach it like so. And then coming from this controller, we're going to have a bonded wire just like the reed switch with two leads coming off of it. So the red wire coming from the controller is going to go, so we can see here, to the blue wire from our reed switch. And then the other wire we have is going to be the black wire. And the black wire we're actually going to be running to a ground, so that's going to go to a white wire here. And if we trace this white wire, you can see where we have our ground located, which is going to be right in here. So you do have to remove this panel here that covers up your door hinge, but then we just use a self-tapping screw and just secured it to the body right there. But now what I'm going to do is, I have all this extra wire here. We don't want that getting tangled up in our brake pedal or accelerator. So we're just going to take some time to sort of secure this. I think I'm just going to actually tuck it behind this panel here. And now finally, we'll take our provided fuse and insert it into the fuse holder here. And then re-secure the cap. So we've got everything done on the vehicle side. We're going to finish up our installation over here on the motorhome. Now we are working in the air, but you guys don't have to lift your motorhome in the air. You can still do it on the ground. It'll be a little bit tighter though, in all honesty, but with that being said, now that we've got ours lifted, let's go ahead and jump under there so we can show you some of the connections we're going to be making. So now we're going to come underneath the motorhome here. So there's two lines that we need to locate, the supply connection and the metered air connection. So you're going to come to your rear axle here, and just directly above your airbags, or your airbags are located, you're going to have your air brakes in the same location as well. Then if we look up from the axle, you should see our sort of our manifold with our valves here. And this is where we're going to be teeing into our airline connections. Now keep in mind, yours is probably going to look completely different because a lot of these steps here and connections are going to be specific to what chassis your motorhome is on. And all motorhomes are obviously not going to use the same chassis. So just for reference, ours is actually a Freightliner chassis. It's one of the smaller ones, so that's the one we're going to be installing it on. So just keep in mind, your connections may be a little bit different, but the process is sort of generic, and it can sort of help you when you install it on yours. If you look in the instruction manual, you're also going to see some more detailed steps depending on what chassis you have. So here's a closer look at all our valves and everything. So for our particular application, we're going to be using these two lines here. So the first one we're going to go over is your metered air connection, which is going to be this line here on our particular application, but again, yours could be different depending on what chassis your motorhome is on. So the metered air connection, it's a good way to find out and check that you have the correct line is to actually remove it from the fitting there. So a lot of times these are just push to connect fittings. You're going to hold the sleeve down, and they can be kind of tricky, but you'll just pull it out like so. You don't have to worry about draining the air lines just yet here, as long as you've identified the metered connection. But in order to test that this is the correct one that we want, the metered connection, what you're going to do is you're going to have someone get in the RV there and pump the brakes. And we should have air come out each time you hit the brake pedal in this metered connection. So if you do get air coming out each time you hit the brakes, you know you've got the correct source here for your metered air. And then the supply air here, you want to make sure that you drain all the air from your air brake system before you splice into this line. But for the supply connection here, it's usually two sort of fittings stacked on one another, and it's usually the lower of those two fittings there. So this particular one is a green line and it's 1/2 inch diameter. We verified that this is a supply connection, and we've already drained all the air from our air brakes there from the metered connection, so now we can go ahead and splice into that line. So again, we've identified the correct 2 lines on our particular chassis. Yours may or may not be different, so make sure you use some of the tips that we just listed and look over the instruction manual so you can find the correct ones on your particular RV. So now that we've identified the correct lines, we can go ahead and make our splices in. So for now, let's pay attention to our supply line connection. So in your kit, you're going to get this type of push to connect air fitting tee. So this is going to work for the vast majority of applications. And basically what we're going to do is, once we've identified the supply line, you're going to cut a section about 8 to 10 inches here from the valve. And then you're going to clean off both ends of the airline tubing there. And I also want to make note that while we're cutting these airlines, we need to make sure that the cut is as straight as possible. So using a pair of tubing cutters like this is certainly ideal. If you're using something like a razor knife, you again just need to be careful that the cut is straight as possible. That way we're not going to have any leaks. But so again, so for this particular one here, this supply line is a little bit smaller than what they normally are. Our supply line is actually a 1/2 inch diameter. Now they're usually a little bit larger than that, about 5/8. So in which case you would just cut this line, attach one end to the tee to one end, and attach the other end of the tee to this end. And then the smaller 1/4 inch line we're going to be running to the air tank that comes in your kit. Now for this particular application, again, this is the Freightliner chassis, and it's sort of the shorter one. Sort of the bus, it's like a larger bus chassis. These actually use a smaller 1/2 inch line as opposed to 5/8, so in which case you're not going to have the parts you need with your kit. You're going to have to go to the store and pick up a T-block like this, and you're also going to have to pick up 2 MPT to air push to connect fittings. So the particular line on this application is a 1/2 inch, so you do need to make sure that the fitting you have has a 1/2 inch there for the airline. And then it doesn't matter what size MPT you use as long as the fitting matches the T-block that you get. And then for this one here, you can just use the fitting that comes in your kit. So again, you're going to have to run to the hardware store. You're going to have to get a T-block and then 2 push to connect air fittings that match up with that T-block that accept a 1/2 inch line. And then again, this fitting here actually comes in your kit. So this is only for the Freightliner chassis that have the smaller wheelbase, the shorter bus length wheelbase. The rest of them, you're going to be able to use the fittings that come in your kit. So for your metered air, luckily, we are going to have the correct size fitting we need in our kit, and it's going to be this plastic push to connect fitting. We have our 1/4 inch up top, and then we have the 2 larger ones on the side there. So we'll just identify our metered air. Again, cut about 8 to 10 inches away. Basically, it doesn't really matter how far away from the valve you cut. You just want to make sure it's a straight section of the line and it's not curved. But we'll just do the same thing as we did with the supply one. Cut it in half, clean your ends, make sure the cuts are nice and straight. Attach one end to one side of the T-fitting and attach the other end to the other side of the T-fitting. Now, we're going to have 2 ports left on the top of our T-fitting for either side. They're both 1/4 inch push to connects. We'll show you these in a bit. We're basically going to be running these to where we have the tank mounted. So next, we're going to mount our air tank assembly. Now, the location that you mount your air tank assembly is really going to vary drastically depending on your particular RV here. I wouldn't say there's one spot that you mount them on in every single one. So really, this is going to be just you looking over the underside of your RV or inside these little storage compartments here to see where you have room. I'm actually just drilled into some of the cross bracing here that hold our mud flaps. And we just need 2 bolts here holding the tank on. So basically, I just drilled through that to secure it like so. And then we're going to have 3 fittings on this actual air tank. We have 2 up top, 1 on the bottom, or 1 on top, 2 on the bottom, depending on how you have it mounted. So 2 of these air fittings are going to go to the T's that we just showed you, and the other one is going to go towards the rear of the RV for our quick disconnect port. So again, a lot of this is going to vary depending on your particular RV here. You just need to make sure that you find a spot that's going to be clear of any heat source or any moving suspension components. So now the last thing we need to install on the motorhome side is going to be our quick disconnect port. So this is going to plug into a jumper, and this is how we're going to transfer the air from the motorhome to our vehicle. So you're actually going to get a little 2-hole bracket that comes in your kit here to mount this. Mounting is really going to be specific to your particular application here. For us, what we did is we just used a no-drill bracket and we clamped it around the hitch tube. We use these pretty commonly for trailer connectors. And we did have to bend it a little bit to suit our application, so we do carry these. You can pick one up if you want to mount yours to this, but you can pretty much mount it anywhere. You could drill it into the bottom side of this valence here. It's really going to be up to you. But now that we have everything installed, we've got the T's installed on our airlines, we've got the air tank installed, and then we have our fitting installed. We're going to take what airline we do have left over and just connect each of these components here using the instructions that you get with your manual. So we won't bore you with showing you exactly where we routed the lines because much of this is going to be specific to your particular RV, but you do need to pay attention when you're connecting them to your air tank assembly. So this bottom connection down here is going to be for the metered air. This connection right here is going to be for the supply air. And then the connection on top here is going to go to the quick disconnect fitting. So go ahead and route all your lines now to the correct locations. And that's going to do it today for our look and installation of the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system here on our 2021 Jeep Wrangler Unlimited.